Hello and welcome to our last set of notes for Chapter 6. We are going to dive into reproduction. This is going to be a bit of an overview. We're going to cover a lot of things, but this is sort of just like the surface level. We would get way more into this when you start year 2 and you get into topic 11. So to begin, let's talk about ovum and spermatozoa. Okay, so what these are the actual cells that are involved in reproduction, right? The egg cell, the sperm cell. Gametes, that's what we call sex cells, are haploid. That means that they have one set of chromosomes. When they fuse together, right, the egg and the sperm, when they fuse together, that's called fertilization, and they form a diploid zygote. So when they fuse together, in fertilization, the half set of chromosomes from the egg and the half set of chromosomes from the sperm come together and make a diploid set, or two full sets of chromosomes in the zygote. That's how humans end up with 46 chromosomes, because 23 are in the egg and 23 are in the sperm. Although only one ovum, egg cell, usually, of course, there are exceptions. This is how some twins are born. Although only one ovum is matured and released per menstrual cycle, a billion or more, a billion with a B, that's so many, sperm cells can be released in a single ejaculation. Okay, but only one sperm is required and realistically able to fertilize that egg cell. So there's a huge discrepancy between how many eggs a biological woman has when released, right? There's only a set number of eggs in their lifetime, whereas sperm cells, they're just like a factory and never stop being made. A billion for every single ejaculation. Like, that's crazy. That's so many cells. Anyways, so let's talk about the male reproductive system. You should absolutely be able to draw and label the male and female, but we're talking about male right now, reproductive system. So let's start off. This is the vas deferens, this tube here, vas deferens, the bladder, which, yes, is pictured in this image, but we would also consider that part of the urinary system or excretory system. Semen gland in the back, prostate gland underneath the bladder, the urethra, which leads out to the outside of the body, the penis, the epididymis, which is like on top, it's around the testes. Okay, so you should be able to draw and label that picture. Sorry, I moved too fast. But anyways, the sperm's journey. So the sperm has quite a journey in the reproductive system. Spermatogenesis is the formation of sperm. I don't need you to know the specifics of spermatogenesis right now, but again, in chapter 11 or topic 11 in year 2, you absolutely will need to know that. So spermatogenesis starts in the testes, and sperm are matured in the epididymis, which is right on the outside of the testes. The sperm is then carried along the vas deferens, which is that tube that leads all the way around the bladder, and then picks up fructose, which is a sugar, for energy, and a protective mucus at the seminal vesicle. They need that protective mucus because the vagina is acidic. And so if they don't have this protective mucus on them, if the sperm don't have this mucus on them, then they will not survive because it's too acidic. The prostate also adds fluids to help neutralize that acid in the vagina, and then ejaculation happens through the penis via the urethra. When we're talking about testosterone, there's a few functions that you absolutely need to know. Number 1, prenatal development of male genitalia. So this is where the penis and the testes develop. It's through testosterone, and it's through these genes, the SRY genes on the Y chromosome. Those genes cause testosterone to surge during male fetus formation, I guess, and that causes the genitalia to develop. When puberty hits, it also causes secondary sexual characteristics, okay? So this is increased aggression, muscle mass, body hair. You get taller, your voice deepens, and this is when sperm production like really begins. And then the third one is sex drive and aggression. So testosterone increases male sex drive and sperm production, which is constant for a male's entire life, which is why like men that are like 60, 70, 80 can actually still have biological children, because the sperm never stops being produced. Aggression, this is like biological evolution, was originally for like hunting and defense back in the day, like millions of years ago, right? Like a long, long time ago. You would be aggressive to like keep predators away from like the rest of the camp. Now it's not super necessary to be that aggressive, but evolutionarily it is still part of the functions of testosterone. So testosterone is still going to increase the amount of aggression that biological males will have. Now, again, you're going to have to be able to draw and label like an image like this, but this time for the female reproductive system. So getting started on this, we have the fallopian tube, which you have two, right? One on each side, the fallopian tube or oviduct. It might be, like in a question, it might say fallopian tube or it might say oviduct. They are the same thing. I find that like in just like everyday language, fallopian tube is more commonly used, but in IB lingo, oviduct is more often used. So just be aware that they are the same thing. Then you have the ovary. The ovaries are these like little grape things on the end of the fallopian tube. Then you have the uterus, which is like this big triangle in the middle. That's the uterus, which is surrounded by the endometrium. Endo meaning inner. This is the inner lining of this whole reproductive system. Endometrium is also what is responsible for, this is what sheds during menstruation every month. The muscle wall is surrounding the endometrium. The muscle wall is responsible for the cramps that happen every month or help with pushing out babies during pregnancies. You have the cervix, which is like the opening to the uterus. You have the vagina, which is in between the cervix and your opening to the outside the body. And then you have the urethra, which is behind this in this image, or I guess to the left of this in this image, and the bladder. So the bladder and the vagina are two different areas in females. Okay, just like gonna say it again. The bladder and the vagina and the uterus, like all of that, vagina and uterus is one section in a biological female's body, and the bladder is a separate secondary section. They are not the same. Not the same. Now let's talk about the actual reproductive system. So the vagina is acidic. We've talked about this when we were talking about sperm production. So it's acidic, which kills bacteria, which is really why it's acidic, but also kills sperm, which is why sperm have to pick up that protective mucus. The cervix is tightly closed and has a mucus plug, which again prevents pathogens and sperm from entering. So it's not like this is like open all the time. It's very like tightly regulated. You don't want to get pathogens or diseases or anything like that. It's an opening to your body, right? Just like the nostrils are an opening to your body, you want to be protected. This is like defense. You don't want to just like allow pathogens in and have it be easy. So acidic and a mucus plug is like lines of defense to prevent that. And then this mucus plug, it sort of loosens up around ovulation, which helps allow sperm through, which helps fertilization occur. Egg cells develop in follicles in the ovaries. And so you have this image, which is an oocyte, which is an egg cell developing into a mature ovum, again happening inside the ovary. The oocyte is a precursor to an egg cell. So when biological females are born, all oocytes exist. Okay, so you have like X amount of oocytes in your body when you're born, if you are a biological female. Once puberty starts, then they begin maturing and are released on a cycle, right? A monthly cycle. That's menstruation. When you run out of cells, when you run out of oocytes, that's when you go through menopause, right? There is an end date. Okay, so this is like if you've ever heard like women saying like, oh no, my biological clock is ticking. This is sort of what they're referring to. Like you only have X amount of eggs, so you can only get pregnant for like X amount of years in your life before you run out of eggs and you go through menopause. Men, biological males, do not have this problem, right? Because they have sperm production throughout their entire lives. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, triggers the development of the follicle and the oocyte. So there is a hormone that's responsible for the maturation of oocytes. So now let's talk about menstrual cycle hormones, okay? So the first two are released and regulated via the pituitary gland, which is in your brain, and then the rest are regulated by the ovaries, which are obviously in the female reproductive system. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates oocyte development. Luteinizing hormone, LH, matures the oocyte and causes release or ovulation, okay? This means that the egg cell is leaving the ovary and traveling along the fallopian tube into the uterus. Estrogen develops the endometrium, that lining around the uterus. So in early, like this is like early, in the early parts of the menstrual cycle, it's a positive feedback on FSH, which means that you're going to continue having FSH, which continues to stimulate oocyte development. In late cycle, it's a negative feedback on both FSH and LH, which kind of like shuts down oocyte development and shuts down the release of the egg, which then like kind of ends the cycle. Progesterone maintains the endometrium, and this has a negative feedback on FSH and LH because if it was positive, it would make the endometrium continue to grow and continue to do all of this. And in a typical monthly cycle, you don't want that. HCG, human chorionic something, I can't remember it right now. I think it's gonadotropin. Pregnancy hormone, this is a pregnancy hormone. It keeps estrogen and progesterone high. If this is released, it is due to the fact that pregnancy has occurred, right? Fertilization has occurred and you are pregnant. And this allows for the endometrium to continue to develop and get thicker and stronger to provide nutrients for the zygote. And then oxytocin is a birth hormone, which causes contractions of the uterus. This is an image of basically what I just said. So we have like the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, LH, right? As like things are happening, this is the beginning, and then ovulation occurs, and woo, look at that spike, and then it comes back down. Whereas in the ovary, what's happening is you have the egg is developing in the follicle, getting bigger and bigger, and then ovulation occurs, and look at that, it is released. That cell is released, and then the follicle sort of disappears and becomes the corpus luteum. The estrogen and progesterone hormones, you have the spike at ovulation, and then progesterone increases after ovulation. This is because it's maintaining the endometrium, and then we see a fall in both of them as the cycle starts to reset. Okay, this is every month this happens. Okay, and then for the days of the menstrual cycle, for like the first, I don't know, let's say 5 days, this is like all in the same time frame. You have shedding of the uterine lining. This is actual menstruation. This is like your period. Okay, and then you have the rebuilding of the endometrium. So the follicular phase is when the follicle is developing, and then the luteal phase is post-ovulation, and this is when your endometrium is the thickest. And then as you get to the end, if fertilization does not occur, then you go back to the beginning of this where the uterine lining is shed. So this is like what I just said, but all in words. So I would pause, you could write this down, but you should be confident in the image on the previous slide. That way, if there's a question about it, or if you are asked to draw the hormones in the menstrual cycle, you would be confident in that. But this is like literally what I just said. Just please pause and write this down. Now, menstrual cramps. If no pregnancy occurs, then the endometrium must be replaced. This is why every month the endometrium is shed and rebuilds itself, because biological females do not actually produce enough like nutrients and everything to maintain an endometrium if it is not being used for pregnancy. It's just not going to happen. It's a waste of energy. So it gets released, it gets shed, and it gets replaced every month. So the endometrium breaks down and releases prostaglandin hormones. Sorry, I don't actually know how to say that word. But it releases hormones to break down the endometrium. And then the uterus muscle starts to contract. It restricts blood flow to the endometrium, and when you restrict blood flow to the endometrium, it starts to die. So that lining dies, and then contractions from the uterus muscles force it out. So think of like when you're, this is gonna be gross and I'm sorry, but think of like when you're squeezing a tube of toothpaste, you're like, that's what's happening in your uterus. It is like you're squeezing it and forcing it out through the cervix in stages. Remember that cervix is pretty small, and it's typically closed with a mucus plug. So these contractions are forcing that mesh mucus plug to kind of open up a little bit and forcing this lining through it. And it happens in stages, and it usually is anywhere from like 3 to 7 days. And cramps can be extremely painful for some people. Some people don't experience any cramps. It's really like all up in the air. Some months are worse than others. So a reason that some months may be worse than others is because of the way that the endometrium breaks down. If it breaks down in clots, or small blockages, it might make cramps more painful because those clots or small blockages have to be pushed through the cervix, and that might be very painful to get that through. Now, in vitro fertilization, we're gonna switch gears. We're done talking about menstruation for right now, but switching gears, in vitro fertilization is for people that are having difficulty getting pregnant. And so once you are determined to be eligible for in vitro fertilization, you are given hormones to stimulate multiple egg releases. Remember that women typically only release 1 egg per month, but you can kind of trick your body into producing multiple eggs. Then those eggs are collected and fertilized with the father's sperm outside of the body, and then they're incubated. So the idea of fertilizing eggs outside of the body, that's like in vitro fertilization. That's like what IVF is. After incubation occurs and there are viable blastocysts, which are basically like viable zygotes, they are selected and developed into embryos. Once those embryos have like developed, then you can move on to the next stage. But all of this happens outside of the body. There are like federal guidelines on how IVF can be used, and guidelines state that up to 3 embryos can be selected for implantation. Now, just because you implant 3 embryos, that does not mean that all 3 embryos are going to take. The hope is that 1 will take. There is, of course, a risk of multiple pregnancies, right? There is a risk that you could have all 3 embryos take, and then you are potentially having triplets all of a sudden. But it does not happen frequently enough to lower that number. Typically, if you are someone that is struggling with infertility, your body is already struggling with it, so this is not like the big enough concern to turn people off from that. So up to 3 embryos can be implanted. Ideally, 1 will take, sometimes more than 1 can take, and then about a month later, a pregnancy test is administered. If a positive pregnancy, then the pregnancy will continue as normal, totally inside of the body. No other concerns. It will just develop naturally. If not, if a pregnancy test comes back negative, none of the embryos took, then you have to wait a little bit, and then you do this whole process again. So this is just like an image of what we were just talking about, but basically you overstimulate, collect the eggs, combine the sperm and eggs outside of the body, let them develop, transfer back into the body, and hope that the uterus accepts the embryo and it takes, and all is well and pregnancy develops as normal. Now, of course, there are ethical considerations, as there are for pretty much anything. Arguments for IVF is the right to have children. This is pretty safe, continually improving medical technology, so it's safer every year. Some governments actually cover the cost of this. Insurance companies can cover the cost of this. This is giving hope to couples or families that cannot conceive by traditional means, and any unused embryos can be stored and used later. So like if you were someone who had 3 embryos taken and you only tried with 2 of them, that 3rd one could stay and you could use it 2 years later to have a sibling or something like that. It can also be donated or as a source of stem cells. Arguments against IVF is this playing God? It's a religious concern. It does prove to be a risk to mothers and fetuses because of the risk of multiple pregnancies. It is extremely expensive if it is not covered by insurance or government. It's we're talking tens of thousands of dollars up to hundreds of thousands of dollars for this. It is extremely expensive. There's also an emotional cost. If someone is already struggling with infertility and then IVF is not working, it's sort of like a failure on top of a failure on top of a failure. It can be extremely taxing emotionally on families, and so this is just something to also be considering. And then the argument that kind of relates back to the abortion argument, where at what point is this ending a human life? If I am creating all these embryos but I'm not using them all, and I terminate them, is that ending a human life? Where is the line drawn? And then the last bit that we're going to get into is the contraceptive pill, birth control. So this is a supplement of hormones, and this basically manipulates the menstrual cycle to prevent pregnancy. So typically when you would be menstruating, you're taking a placebo pill. It's usually an iron supplement because you're losing so much blood that you're replacing it with an iron supplement. And then the blue pill, which is what you take the rest of the month, is taken at the same time every day. That is vitally important, is to maintain the levels of hormones in your bodies consistently. And it's made with estrogen and progestin, which is synthetic progesterone, And it basically does exactly what estrogen and progesterone do. It just kind of tricks your body into thinking either that an egg has already been released and everything is good, but it prevents the sperm from actually connecting with an egg. It just kind of manipulates the body into assuming that all systems are either already pregnant. There are some that trick the body into thinking you're already pregnant, so it doesn't release eggs, or it just prevents viable eggs from being released so that there can be no connection. This is, again, an image where it has all of the hormones that we were talking about. You should definitely be able to draw and label this. And this would be a good, like, hey, I should quiz myself, what are these for the four main ones, right? FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone. You should be able to label all of them and explain what's happening throughout the cycle. All right, great job. That's it for this chapter, and I will see you in class.